Hello, everybody. My name is Annabelle. I'm Senior Advisor on the Built Environment for IHRB. Welcome, everybody, to this event on financing human rights-based decarbonisation in Europe's built environment. It's going to be a dynamic conversation between civil society, investors, local governments and industry for critical actors in ensuring that the process of decarbonising Europe's buildings with lessons for beyond is done in a just and equitable way. Look, I'll hand over in a second to James Drinkwater of Laudes Foundation. We'll then have a short summary of the new Better Buildings report and jump right into the panel discussion. So while you're watching, if you want to be using social media, two hashtags that we'll be actively using are Better Buildings and Dignity by Design. So make this as dynamic as possible. Use the chat box and Q&A. And over to you, James.
Fantastic. Thanks, Annabelle, and to the whole IHRB team for having us here. From the Laudes Foundation to offer a few opening remarks. If we could move the slides on, please. So this takes me a little bit back down memory lane to an event in Madrid where there were hundreds of energy efficiency in buildings folk gathered to really push forward this renovation revolution across Europe. And that's now turned into a renovation wave. And everyone in the room was furiously agreeing. And we'd had presenters talking about the wonderful climate benefits of highly energy efficient buildings with integrated renewables and so on. And then after one of the speakers had finished, another speaker stood up and invited us all to close our eyes and embodied just for a moment for the crowd the voice of someone from one of the marginalized local communities in the city that was hosting us. And it was a real moment that struck us with just how alienating, how uninclusive often this agenda we often all vigorously agree with in the green building community can seem if it isn't one that really drives for equality. And it's a very, very fervently held belief of us at the Laudes Foundation that as we are fighting the climate crisis, we need to address really the human side of this crisis along with it and really tackle inequality. And indeed bringing together these two agendas, decarbonising the built environment and the wonderful work on human rights-based approaches that the IHRB are leading on, is a really fantastic opportunity to change the game and transition with the communities who need to make this transition with us. Slide, please. I think from our side, we see that the just transition that is now really starting to gain some pace in Europe presents a window of opportunity here. We're deeply decarbonising the built environment with a raft of new policies coming, but it's a relatively nascent field. IHRB is really standing out as a leader, really starting to deeply join decarbonisation and social equity concerns together into a single agenda and providing a voice for those who don't have one. I think it's critical. The most vulnerable do not have a voice at the table of industry, political and financial transition in this sense. So great to be really focused on that. Slide, please. And as we kick off, just a small call to action, I think, from our side. We really need to build that field. And I think IHRB are really a champion in that field, building a strong narrative and awareness around the issues that we'll be debating today and hear experts' views on. We need to really be enabling connective action, so actually demonstrating what's possible when we take much more human-centric approaches and working to empower those new voices of the most vulnerable communities, workers and others in this huge sector, those voices that aren't often heard and shouldn't simply be voiced over in conferences by others, but which really should be at the table with us. So fantastic to have the dialogue and event today. I'd really encourage everyone to join forces with this fantastic champion in the field, the IHRB team, to collaborate and indeed for the whole green building community to keep an eye on this topic and embed approaches that really do truly reduce rather than increase inequality, something perhaps to date we've not been so good on. So Annabelle, with that, I'll hand back to you and looking forward to the event.
Thank you, James. And likewise, thanks to you and all of your colleagues at Laudes for really also being a champion of this agenda. Also for the great words about the work of IHRB. I should also emphasize, as you say, this is a field, this is an ecosystem. So I feel like a key part of this process is really us working in partnership with as many local civil society organizations, people working within industry and finance, sort of boots on the ground to make all of this happen in the right direction. So Hayley, if I could have just the next slide, please. So when everyone signed up for this event, we asked people, in what ways are you currently working on climate and or human rights in the built environment? And this word cloud just gives a snapshot of some of the answers that came through from you all. So we thought we'd share that to give a sense as to who's in the room. Also, I want to emphasize that among the participants are a key mix of finance, civil society, industry, and local government. And that's one of the very key roles that we want to be playing at the intersection of those groups. Next slide, please. We also asked what you would like the speakers to be addressing during the event. So if you just sort of absorb that cloud for a minute, that provides an insight into the kinds of things that people are hoping to get out of the conversation today. All right, next slide. So as some of you may have seen, and if not, make sure you check out the website and download it. We recently launched the report, Better Buildings, Financing Human Rights-Based Decarbonisation in Europe's Built Environment. I want to give a big shout out at this moment to Ursula Hartenberger and Alejandro Rivera, who were co-authors on this report and just did an awesome job at bringing these different perspectives together and setting a vision for the way forward with clear recommendations. This slide captures some of the key policy drivers that are underway at the moment. And I should emphasize at this point, while this particular report focuses on Europe, one, it's part of a global program that we have working with partners in other regions as part of the Coalition for Dignity in the Built Environment. And secondly, really hoping that for those from other regions on the call, there are lessons from here and also vice versa, you know, lessons from other regions that may be leading in some ways back into what's going on in Europe. Next slide, please. Context-wise, also wanted to ground everybody in terms of when we say decarbonizing the built environment, what are we talking about? There are 4 areas that we really lift up in the report, and emphasizing that action on all of these is important and that thinking about human rights in the context of all of them is important in terms of renovating, maximizing the use of existing buildings, ensuring that there's opportunities to use buildings that are currently sitting empty is key, bearing in mind, I think 85 to 95%, according to BPIE, of Europe's current housing and building stock will still be standing in 2050. What are the scopes in terms of imaginative and creative ways to be building the new buildings that we still will need to be building, given population growth, immigration into the region, and the need for adequate housing. Access to green space, which is key to the decarbonisation agenda, as well as to resilience and adaptation. And then also the use of materials, which is such a fundamental piece of this in terms of moves towards circular construction, but also what are the issues and risks throughout built supply chains, both in terms of environmental and climate impacts, but human impacts too. Next slide, please. The report has 6 key sections, and throughout we have a lens on mitigating risk and maximizing opportunity. And those 2 threads are key throughout the whole of our work on the built environment, and saying that, first of all, in line with international human rights commitments, with the UN guiding principles on human rights, decisions have to mitigate risks to people with a real emphasis on the most vulnerable. Second, recognizing that inherently there are huge amounts of opportunity in channeling the way that finance and industry moves in this space in a way that unlocks positive social outcomes. So we're balancing those 2 pieces through these 6 issue areas. We'll hear quite a bit today on the right to housing. I want to flag also that, you know, this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation, and so there are opportunities for further deep dives. We really welcome your ideas on how to go deeper into any of these 6 issues, working in partnership with others. On health, we're thinking about both mental and physical health. On workers, we're thinking about workers on construction sites and the skills that will be needed, but also through supply chains. Equality is a single word that captures a lot. The lens we're using here is the fundamental cross-cutting human rights principle of equality before the law and non-discrimination. So cross-cutting thread of non-discrimination. And then we also bring in the lens of spatial inequality and inequality between regions and even within cities themselves. And how can that be addressed front on in the ways that we decarbonize? Participation in terms of not only joining in conversations, but having agency over outcomes, and then recognizing that technology and the move to a green and digital Europe is a key driver here in the use of technology. So being sure that rights to privacy, to data collection are respected, and that the human rights supply chains of new materials used in the digital revolution are taken into account. Next slide, please. Last point is when you dig into the recommendations, you'll see that they're formulated in these three groups. So we have clear recommendations for governments in terms of the leverage that they have, both in terms of policy making nationally and critically at the local level too, where governments are closest to people's lived lives, and their procurement practices, recognizing governments have huge heft through their procurement decision-making processes. On the finance side, the two key points of leverage we're lifting up are: where do investors allocate their capital, and also how do they engage companies that are in their portfolios, their investees. Below those two sort of macro level areas, we have recommendations at project level, where I'd like to lift up the framework for dignity in the built environment, which is a way to really think about risks to people and ways to maximize social outcomes throughout the life cycle of a project. So these three dynamic spaces are the areas that we really hone in on our recommendations. So download the report, have a read. I now want to hand over to IHRB CEO John Morrison and the panel discussion that he'll be chairing.
Thanks, Annabelle, and welcome to everybody. Very much looking forward to the discussion. So I'd like to welcome, well, I'm the CEO of IHRB. I think Annabelle said that. Welcome to our discussion today. We have a panel of 4 experts who I'd like to welcome on stage now. Leilani Farha is the CEO of The Shift, but she's known also as the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing. Nikolai Pedersen from UNPRI, that's the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. Suzanne Bauer from the city of Vienna and also Eurocities. And also Christine Lemaitre from DGNB, which is the German Sustainable Building Council. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see you all today. I think we're just missing one, and that's Christine. She's just arriving. So, Leilani, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. Now, in our report, as Annabelle said, we really do emphasize the right to adequate housing, which I know was key to your mandate and key to your ongoing work. What do you see as some of the specific risks that the right to housing faces as Europe moves to decarbonize its buildings? And who are some of the communities and groups that are most at risk against negative impacts?
First of all, let me just start by saying thank you for inviting me into this conversation, and thanks to the IHRB for taking such leadership on this issue and putting the right to housing front and center, because I think it should be front and center. I've identified, I guess, what I would say 5 risks. And I want to start, well, maybe 3 risks and 2 preliminary comments. I want to start by saying that residential real estate, or the housing sector, is one of the least regulated sectors, business sectors in the world, and yet a sector that is squarely situated within a human right, that is the right to housing. And that's a very important piece in terms of the risks. The other thing I want to say is that it's the lowest income households and the most vulnerable populations who are living in some of the least energy efficient homes. So who am I talking about? Obviously, migrants and refugees, single parents, people just who have a low income, persons with disabilities, racialized communities, depending on where you live, indigenous communities, etc. And so the biggest risks in terms of the right to housing are around affordability, absolutely, because what we're already seeing is that investors, property owners in residential real estate will say energy efficiency and, you know, striving for zero emissions is expensive. And someone has to bear that cost, and tenants are going to have to partially bear that cost. So that's obviously a real risk, or a risk because the sector is so unregulated, a risk that even where there are governments involved saying, no, we're going to subsidize this, that they will find a way to both get the subsidy and raise rents. And that's obviously something that we want to keep our eye on. The other risk is, of course, displacement, or what's often called renoviction. We've already seen this. For example, in Poland, there's a city in Poland where this has happened, where a move toward more green properties has resulted in the erosion of social housing and displacement of tenants, because these buildings suddenly become au courant, very attractive, they're energy efficient, and therefore the owners know they can get more rents out of them. And so you see a displacement of one class of people and a replacement with another class of people. I will also talk about new builds, just to say that where new buildings are concerned, I've heard many property developers say, you want me to incorporate affordable units into my new build, but if I'm going to meet all of the green criteria, it's expensive, and I cannot afford to ensure that my buildings are both green and affordable. And so that's obviously a real concern. And lastly, I'll just put on the table, my biggest concern is that we do not have in place in Europe or elsewhere, in my opinion, effective monitoring and accountability mechanisms to ensure that none of this happens, all these risks that I've just talked about. And so that's obviously, when we get into where to from here solutions, that's obviously something I would want to look at.
No, very good. And I sometimes call this sort of green utopian thinking, you know, that sort of bypasses the social aspects and the dangers of that. So concretely, taking two of these key players, the investment community and local governments, what would you like them to do to ensure that the right to housing remains central to the decarbonisation journey?
Well, I mean, with respect to investors in real estate, let's understand the situation Europe is in. In the last 10 years, you've seen a 700% increase in the number of institutional investors in housing. So you have a highly invested private property sector. And with that, what you've seen are radically increasing rents. If you go to Berlin, for example, which was one of the most reasonable places to live in terms of affordability, Berliners have seen 50% increases in rents in the last few years. So it's difficult to believe that that sector is going to monitor itself with respect to the right to housing. I'm not sure the sector really understands that there is a human right to housing that has standards, that has affordability measures, that has adequacy standards, security of tenure regulations, regulations around evictions and forced evictions. So I'm not convinced the sector can do this itself. It does need to open itself up to this conversation about the right to housing and their role in implementing the right to housing. City governments are already doing a ton of things. If you look, especially in Europe, the city of Berlin, the city of Barcelona, for example, two leading examples, Vienna, there are many other. Amsterdam is doing some interesting things. So, you know, what they're doing is regulations. They're coming up with regulations that work to basically protect tenants from rent increases and insecure tenure, putting caps on rent, stabilizing leases to be longer term, five-year leases, for example. Those sort of protective measures can push back against the risks that I identified.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. I'll come back to you in a bit. Just while we're talking, those of you who are listening, you can start asking questions straight away. You'll see that there's a questions tab, and that allows you to submit your questions. After I've heard the initial comments from each of the speakers, I'm going to start weaving in the questions that you send, and also the questions that some of you have already posed when you registered. So we already have a number of good questions there. Now, Nikolai, moving on to you. The UN Principles for Responsible Investment. Now, I guess in the past 2 or 3 years, investors have really got climate, right? I mean, no one's going to argue that they haven't got the message around climate. But why human rights, right? Why should investors care about the human rights piece, and in what ways can they take some steps to underpin that commitment?
Yeah, thanks, John. And can I also just start by saying I'm very delighted and humbled to be part of this panel and really looking forward to this discussion. So I completely agree with your assessment that climate change is now widely understood by the investment industry as a material risk that they need to deal with. The S of ESG, so environmental and social and governance issue, the S there has probably been the least well understood by the investment community. So that's certainly the experience of the PRI in the roughly 15 years we've been in existence. So there's really 3 reasons why we're now focusing on human rights. The first one is clarity. There have been a lot of different approaches, different types of assessments, different benchmarks on social issues. For example, if we look at the data providers, it's quite telling how little correlation there is between each of these providers' assessment of specific companies on social issues. So there's a lot of confusion clearly in the industry about what matters and what doesn't. So really in human rights, we're getting a clear framework here, and there's decades of knowledge and understanding of the particular issues in question. So that's the first reason. It does provide us with some clarity. The second one is really consistency, because we're also lucky to have an increase in regulation around the world, very strongly in the EU. We have different types of due diligence regulation, some with slightly more narrow focus, such as modern slavery or child labor, some with more wide human rights focus. But what they all have in common is this due diligence idea. So if we build our ESG approaches on human rights and these recognized international standards, we get some consistency. And as international investors with diverse portfolios, we ensure that we comply with the different sets of regulations in different jurisdictions. And then the third one is really around consequence. So human rights is, of course, about the lives of real people. And again, we secure by using these frameworks that there is a real impact, because there are such clear policies and process requirements. We ensure that there's also a real impact from the decisions we make based on social issues or human rights issues. Now, I noticed in the word cloud you put up initially that a lot of people had mentioned social issues and human rights issues as key. Social issues was actually a bigger font or size, if you will, but at the PRI we really see human rights as the foundation for working on social issues. So we don't see these as separate by any means, but just in the human rights frameworks we do get more consequence. And very importantly, this also helps us as an industry, as the financial industry, to contribute to the achievements of the SDGs, which is of course crucial.
I sometimes think with ESG, I mean, Al Gore once used the term inconvenient truth in terms of carbon and climate, but I think somehow human rights can be the inconvenient truth of ESG. You mentioned that the E leads the S. Is there a danger there's a siloed approach, where you have investors working on E over here, working on S, maybe using human rights over there? Or do you see that there is the real opportunity for integration? And what does integration look like in the context of the built environment?
Yeah, no, I think that that certainly is a risk. It's tempting to treat the issues as separate, but I would also not, I guess I would not downplay the need for deep expertise on both sides of the spectrum. Now, climate change is of course also a human rights issue, and I think it was Mary Robinson that termed it the most important human rights issue. So dividing them is really a conceptual convenience. If anything, they are obviously very much related. And so one of the areas in which we see this done is of course the idea of the just transition. So we know very well that we are in let's say, short of time. There's urgency, and we need a fast transition to net zero. Very quickly, this has been clarified just a few weeks ago by the IEA report, but also recently by the IPCC 2008 report. Now, the risk, of course, is that if we don't address social issues as we try to secure this transition, we're simply not going to succeed, because there'll be backlash. It's important that the transition is acceptable to people, both from a sort of political viewpoint, in the sense that the regulation and the initiatives that we need to be successful will not be successful in a democratic system if citizens widely don't see that it benefits them as well. So there is certainly risk here from a political point of view, but also for investors, because just as the climate urgency is recognized as probably the most important systemic risk, also from an investment point of view, there is also an increasing understanding of economic inequality, which I would widely categorize as a mismanagement of human rights issue by business and investors, and that is also a really important systemic risk which investors cannot hide from. So we know the consequences in economic terms, that if wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, it might negatively impact growth over time. But I think also the associated polarization that we see and political disruption is extremely harmful to investors and business, who by and large value stability. So yeah, certainly important to integrate the two.
No, very good. Thank you. Right, come back to you later. Right, Christine. No, Suzanne first, and then Christine. City of Vienna, and you're also chair of the Eurocities Working Group on Housing. Now, Vienna is a human rights city, which is, as well as being a very beautiful city, and you're known for having a progressive housing policy that has managed to improve energy efficiency at the same time as without driving up the costs of housing dramatically. How have you done that, and how can you translate that approach to other cities?
First of all, thanks very much for inviting me and giving me the chance to show the point of view of a city. How we've done that, I will refer to urban renewal. So our aim in urban renewal is to improve the buildings and apartments to a high standard. And I think this is where it's going to be important to keep them affordable at the same time. So whereas, and now I'm getting critically, completely private urban renewal initiatives can cause massive social problems on a neighborhood and city level, the practice of gentle urban renewal in Vienna aims to renovate of the old buildings without pushing former residents out of the area. And this strategy can be seen as a best practice example for sustainable urban renewal, and which was granted with the UN Habitat Prize in 2000. So the model of sustainable or gentle urban renewal has made a significant contribution to improving living conditions in the city of Vienna. And a decisive factor in this process is that urban renewal is understood as an interdisciplinary challenge where social, economic, cultural, aesthetic, and ecological demands must be taken into consideration. Urban renewal requires future-oriented, strategic, continuing development, which reflects the possibility for the city as an evolving system. And gentle urban renewal pursues the goal of linking affordable housing with economic use of resources, mixed use, social mix is really high on our agenda, and adaptation to the existing infrastructure. Reconversion and upgrading of the existing urban stock is counterposed to demolition and new building. So the Viennese model of gentle urban renewal places residents in the foreground so as to minimize the repression frequently induced by improvement activities. Owners and residents are involved in this progress. Now, high standards in new construction, as well as the promotion of thermal energy renovation, reduces the energy expenditure and thus the operating costs as well as the CO2 emissions. And to give you a concrete number, now for Vienna, a total of over 300,000 residential units have been refurbished since 1984. So it's an ongoing permanent process. And one of the really good results is this has reduced carbon dioxide emissions by over 350,000 tons per year. And I think we have to continue on this way and actually getting much better.
Great. And as you've been talking, beginning to see some questions coming in, just to tell the audience that if you don't want to ask a question, what you can do is you can upgrade other people's questions. There's a voting system on there as well. So I do encourage everybody to get involved in that process. Suzanne, congratulations on that. But what do you need from national governments and also from investors for you to decarbonize in a socially just way? What is it that you need from others to continue to upscale what you're doing? And what do other city councils need to do what you're doing?
First of all, I think at the basis is a political will and clear commitment from the national government. And I think this is an essential starting point. Furthermore, we really need a strong and supportive framework where affordability and effective decarbonization are going hand in hand, just to prevent renovictions. And Leilani already pointed out, evictions on the ground that the building needs large-scale renovation. And the results were, unfortunately, segregation. So for Vienna, I want to give an example. We do see a need to combine the funding issues with the existing national rent law so that it is fair and socially balanced. And a main criteria of the initiative should be to apply strict rules to achieve housing cost neutrality. And this is a keyword for me for the European Green Deal, because rent increases by renovations must be balanced by energy efficiency to avoid renovictions and gentrification. So just to allow me to give you an example, the International Union of Tenants, for example, calls for a European Code of Conduct for renovation. And that would mean including tenants' participation in renovation projects, as it is the case in the Responsible Housing Initiative, and making rental laws more socially balanced by considering funding and financing issues within existing national rental laws. And in this way, rent increases by renovation can be balanced by energy efficiency to avoid renovictions and pricing out tenants through gentrification. So, but what you already said, we also really have to have a reliable financial basis. And this is where it really becomes interesting. This is where we really welcome the European Green Deal. And it is crucial that we get the renovation wave right and make sure that it leaves no one behind. The Affordable Housing Initiative should be a wave to bring affordability and social inclusion to the ground. It should contribute to create jobs and small, medium-sized enterprises, so to help the local construction sector, focus on areas with social problems and making housing fit for the aging population. It should also lead to measurable reduction of the greenhouse gas emission and employ digital advances at district level. The initiative should also serve as a policy lab, for example, improvements in EU policies on state and procurement that can support the local renovation project. The key point, however, is financing, and therefore a specific funding program is necessary.
Great, thank you for that. That's very clear. Now, Leilani, at the beginning, she mentioned that actually some of the poorest communities in many of our cities are those that are suffering the worst environmental conditions at the moment. And Nikolai and you, Suzanne, have given, I think, some very interesting examples of how the E and the S have to remain linked. Christine, in your work at the German Sustainable Building Council, I mean, you're working at the level of certifying green building projects. How easy has it been to expand that to social outcomes? You know, is it welcome that you include the social in a green building scheme, or does it make sense?
Well, thanks. Well, it definitely does make sense, and it's non-negotiable. So we never had that discussion, because our approach is really that it has to be a holistic approach. You cannot just only looking at the climate issue or social issues or resource issues separately. So it always depends, and it's always about finding the best solution for the project at hand, either new construction or renovation. So for us, that's been always the case. And I have to say, sure, when you look at the evaluation, we look at the certifications, we have certain mechanisms to ensure that certain qualities have to be achieved in order to certify. And the social part is something where the investors always try to shy away from, because they don't feel, we've heard that already, you know, it's not, you cannot really measure it in euros. But I would say over the past years, it has increased, and we have reworked the system dramatically in order to as well show the impact on the city level, because I think this is always very important. It's not just a building by itself. A building is a piece of a puzzle of a city. And so a building has to bring a positive impact to its location. And we're working in the housing sector, but as well in the commercial real estate sector. And there we're really pushing for creating spaces where people can access the building, certain kind of facilities, even if they don't work or live there. So it becomes really a positive spot with greenery, with certain qualities, and to really put it all together. And I think for us, it's really nice. What we're trying to bring back maybe is we're building buildings because of people. And in many discussions, I feel like it's completely forgotten. And sorry, but you know, in Germany, then you have the real estate industry, and some of them use a lot of English terms while they speak German. And and then you always have the asset, you know, the asset under management and so forth. And I'm in so many meetings where after a few minutes I ask, but you still live in a house, right? Because we allowed it that somehow real estate is the investment good number one. And I think the key, and I think there Vienna is really a role model, is the land policy, is, you know, who owns the land? Because if we look at construction prices, there are many studies already out there, and I'm pretty sure this is the same in other countries. It really depends on the value of the land. And many, many municipalities have gone down the road where they sold off the land to private investors. And sure, the private investor wants to make money, and it's part of the system. You know, you just want to invest as much as you have to and get the most out of it. So you have this kind of system created where I think we need a combination of regulation, of municipalities to cities to step up. And we see some cities in Germany who do that, who come up with regulations. If you want to build there, we have a possibility that they buy back the land. So they have the pre-bidding right, so they can buy the land back. Because I think the whole game changes once the city is basically the client. You know, you can do different things. You can negotiate differently with the construction companies, and you don't have this financial pressure as a private company has. So I think this is a very crucial point that we have to really look at the land policy. And the other thing I always don't like is, and I think we have to come down to that as well, we have to have a fact-based and data-based discussion. I have that a lot when I introduce myself somewhere and I'm like, yeah, I'm from the Sustainable Building Council. Then the person across says, oh, sustainability, oh, this is expensive. And I said, this is amazing how you could calculate that in a fraction of a second for an imaginary project, you know, and just allow this kind of discussion that somehow, you know, we have this rumor out there that sustainability is more expensive. And we have certified now around 8,000 projects. We evaluate a lot, and they have to all do a life cycle cost analysis as part of the certification. And we have so many examples where we see there's no connection between the aim or the ambition of sustainability to the construction cost. It has to do with planning, with a structure, with a systematic approach. And this is as well what we force or put a lot of pressure in the certifications are basically you can achieve them with 3 different products on the market. So we're not trying to have an exclusive system, but to be very inclusive and as well to aim on quality as
Oh, we've lost Christine, I think, which is a real shame because it was getting very, very interesting. I just was reflecting as she was speaking. I don't want to badmouth my own country or London, for example, but next week is International Clean Air Day, and I think the UK government has been taken to court now, has lost in court 3 times on the issue of clean air. And of course, we have the whole legacy of the Grenfell Tower disaster and the deaths there as well. I'll come back to Christine when she comes back in, but while we're waiting for Christine to dial back in, we've had a number of questions in. So I'm going to throw out 3 questions to all 3 of you, and pick whichever ones you want to answer. One has come from Rob Davidson. Can a single entity monitor housing affordability, including greening impact, or does it need to be a multi-stakeholder collaboration, allowing for a more holistic lens, avoiding silos? If so, what could that look like? We have a question here from Ursula Hartenberger. A question for Nikolai. What specific mechanisms or even metrics do investors have to put in place to ensure full transparency in terms of financial processes when it comes to human rights issues within real estate investment? And I'll add in a third question that comes from some of the early questions we got on gender. I believe Vienna has prioritized gender mainstreaming for quite a long time now. Gender seems to be a very crucial dimension to any human rights approach, particularly when we think about the built environment. I'd love to hear from any of you, and particularly you, Suzanne, about how the mainstreaming of gender is a key part of your human rights approach. Suzanne, maybe we'll start with you on the gender issue, and then I'll come to Nikolai and Leilani. Suzanne.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think this is a very important question, because first of all, I want to point out that women are particularly exposed to the housing crisis, and unfortunately, women are more often affected by poverty, due in part to the wage and pension gap between women and men, and the fact that they more often have part-time jobs. And women's homelessness is often less visible, and that it needs to be specifically addressed, because something you can't see, you're not going to address. Now, jumping to the city of Vienna, Vienna's government has made the city a safer and more convenient place for women after incorporating a gender lens into urban design. The city has improved streetlights, made parks more accessible for young girls, and widened pavement and designed social housing and new neighborhoods for the need of women. So in Vienna, more than 60% of the residents live in subsidized and social housing. And the competition for the contracts for this infrastructure has long involved quality assessments of proposals on various dimensions, from aesthetic to functionality. Now, actually better than the 19th, contracts have also been assessed from a gender perspective. And this is actually the change I'm talking about. If you are part of the mainstream planning process, you can really get somewhere. The architects and developers have really become aware, because if they don't fulfill the criteria, they are less likely to win the competition. And smaller projects, for example, may be asked to redesign their plans. So for a long time, women had been left out of the city or in the city planning, and therefore no accounting for the movements took place. And giving another example is, however, for example, green spaces contribute to the overall upgrading of a district. They are also an answer to the question of distribution between the sexes, and gender-responsive planning takes equal account of different using groups or user groups and living situation. So it creates high-quality green spaces and contributes to the completion and connection of the open space network. And this distributive justice of the open space supply is increased. So green spaces are a key to climate protection by avoiding heat islands, and green space improves the microclimate. And now you really can bring this together while you're saying, okay, we've got the gender perspective, not in the end, not somewhere saying, yes, I've got an idea, but it's a cross-cutting part in the whole planning process. And I think this is really, really important to change it to the good.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you for that. Nikolai, on the question of gender, but also the question specifically directed to you around metrics or mechanisms for investors in this space.
Yeah, thanks, John. Can I just, on the point here about gender and racial diversity, recognize that, of course, the financial industry has a pretty big problem there. There is, I mean, purely from a human rights point of view, there are problems here, but it's also problematic that an industry that manages the funds of and the assets and savings of all of us doesn't properly represent the diversity that exists in the population. So it is a primary issue for the PRI, and there's actually a report. So this is a bit of a teaser. There's a report coming out later in the summer. A colleague of mine, Elena Espinosa, is responsible for that program. So we are putting heightened attention on it, and we're also putting out some case studies actually over the summer on how different investors are working with diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So yeah, just to recognize that. On the second question, it's a really good question. I think it was Leilani who mentioned earlier that, of course, the regulation in this space is pretty low, and there's variation around Europe, obviously. So I would say the extent to which investors are transparent about ESG issues, including human rights, in their investments, varies depending on the sophistication of the individual investor. And here there's, I think, certainly on human rights, that is a new issue to a lot of participants in the financial industry. So that's why the PRI is putting increased attention on it. Certainly seeing real estate and the right to housing within that, seeing those as connected issues, I also don't think is widely understood. And again, here there's a bit of irony in, say, a lot of investments which are, these are our savings, these are our pension savings. And so in building up the money, which is obviously a public good, but building up the savings that we need to retire, we are undermining our own ability to afford housing, for example. So the whole connection between the investment purpose of pension assets, for example, and accumulating savings for citizens widely, and the actual sustainability outcomes associated with the way we invest, I think there's a disconnect here where we need to pay a lot more attention. So it's positive to see that within the EU now we have the green taxonomy, which of course from a climate point of view starts to make it really obvious which investments are aligned with the EU's goal on reaching net zero and which ones are not. And I was pleased to find that of course there are this idea of social minimum social safeguards, which talks about the UN guiding principles in there. Yeah. So it does connect the E and S agendas, but I think the second part again is less specific and is less well understood. So there is work on the way on a potential social taxonomy, which I think is required. We simply need to be much more specific about what specific investment does from both an environmental and a social point of view, and we need that transparency.
And then there are other climates, I mean, I think about TCFD and others that don't have any social risk dimension at all in them. But not time to get into that. Welcome back, Christine. I'll come to you in a second.
Sorry, I've been talking the whole time.
Anyway, you made a huge impact when you were with us. I particularly the issue of seeing housing and land as assets. Leilani, you might want to come back on any of the points made, but particularly that first question, I think, around affordability and whether, in effect, you need a multi-stakeholder approach to monitoring that. Do you want to come back on that or any other point?
I'll come back on that very briefly. I absolutely think you need a multi-stakeholder approach. And you need accountability mechanisms at different levels, and monitoring at different levels. So at city level, at national state level, at even community level, you could have. But there's a couple of things I'm sort of trying to piece together. I mean, the human rights offer an actual framework that could be used and should be used, in my opinion, as the green wave, moves forward, because it offers things like notions around participation, and that gets to the gender issue. I really loved Suzanne's comments. You were so bang on with those comments. I mean, the fact is, housing has been largely financialized. That's what all of us are talking about in different ways. We haven't used that term particularly, but that's what Christine was talking about, and Nikolai and Suzanne. And financialization has completely removed tenants, women, racialized communities, etc., from the conversation, completely removed them. And so if we were to frame and use human rights as the frame going forward, it would require participation. It would require that women's equality be considered and understood. And then it would require accountability mechanisms. So that's my sort of pitch, that human rights isn't just individual rights and entitlements. It's a process, it's a framework. It provides us with a way to move forward. I always say it's a way of governance, actually. So those were the comments that I wanted to make, not exactly on point. But.
No, I wanted to come back on that point actually and ask you a follow-up on that, because over half of the world's population now living in cities, right? I mean, we move beyond Europe and how does this work in practice, right? How do you actually bring minorities of all kinds into a conversation about their built environment in a way that's meaningful and real and not tokenistic, or isn't just the kind of thing that city councillors say, this is what we're elected to do anyway? How, through your own work, what does it look like?
Yeah, there aren't very many good examples, to be honest. But I have seen in Asia, for example, where people living in informal settlements, so informally with no recognized legal title to land, forming associations, community associations, and being granted a real political seat at the table, and regular meetings with government and constant conversation and interaction. And it has led, for example, to communities being allowed to stay on the lands that they've been inhabiting for years and years and years, and decades, and a more formalization of their living arrangements as a result of their meaningful engagement and participation. But I mean, we're pretty light years away from that in the Northern Hemisphere. I have to say that. I mean, I obviously there are probably examples at community level, and that's where it's going to help most. That's going to be where it works best. But I've been engaged in discussions right now, for example, with a variety of cities around talking to people living in homelessness. And actually asking them what their solutions are to homelessness. Well, that's for city officials even, that feels like a very daunting and difficult task for them to meaningfully engage, to understand that people living in homelessness are actually human beings and part of the human family. That's like a stretch. So we've got some work to do.
Yeah, well, this is great. Christine, I think you're going to be part of that work, right? So. I had another question for you before we lost you, which is what are the key drivers we need to grow the awareness of exactly what you were saying, that there shouldn't be a trade-off between green and social, and that property and land are not just assets, they're part of the human condition, part of the human environment. How do we get there, right? How do we break the sort of vicious circle we're in at the moment? What would you like to see? And I think maybe another question for you is, from before, is what are the barriers and challenges to ensure that social equity is key part of it? And again, what would you like to see from central government and the financial community to get us there, Christine?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's teamwork. Unfortunately, it's not just one player who can change it all. So I think what we try, and I think what we need is to establish a different culture, a different appreciation for our built environment. Because if you look at social critical districts, if you look at the buildings there, I mean, you know, you can already see it in the architecture. And you see so many spaces like the suburbs of Paris, or, you know, even in big German cities, you know, where you just see already from the architecture, it is not done with appreciation. You know, it's just providing basically cover. And I think this is a different culture we have to establish, that this is our built environment. I mean, we're in the middle of climate change, so we will to adapt to many, many things. And the built environment is something we can design in a way that we feel healthy and happy there. And we have to come back to this inclusive understanding, because I think a big key part is as well that people care for the buildings they live or work in. And I've always find that horrible, you know, if you look at infrastructure. You know, at these public places where basically everything is designed in a way so people cannot break it. I mean, this is just such a wrong kind of culture, where I think, and this is, I think, where the cities have to step up to come up with concepts, and we see that more and more, you know, which is good, that public places are being, you know, created where people feel well, where you bring greenery back in the city. Like I said earlier, you know, a building is just a piece of the puzzle. In the end, it's about the city. And I think we've all experienced that now in the pandemic, where you could not travel, you know, you could not go somewhere on vacation, how important it is that the city that you're surrounding, that you have access to greenery, that you can go outside. And I think this kind of different understanding and a new culture of appreciation, I think that has to happen as well in schools. I mean, we spend 90% of our times in buildings. We work there, we live there, we study there, and we basically don't care if it's not by profession. And, you know, I think if you would be all in a room, I would ask that. Who today looked around where they're sitting right now and asked the question, do I feel comfortable here? Because it's not, you know, I think one is the social issue, but I think in the other side, it's really this topic of appreciation, of understanding this is our built environment. And I think other cultures, like in the global south, they have a different history. But we're such a bad role model that all of a sudden they start to build cities the way we build it here. And now they start to see all these social problems arising. So I think we really have to have a turnaround. And what I as well really would like to see is a new sense of honesty, because we never talk really about what goes wrong. We always see the great renderings, you know, of new projects, new concepts, but we never ask what came out of it. You know, did we make mistakes? And I think especially internationally, this is so important, because we made so many mistakes in Europe, even talking about renovation, you know, over insulating the buildings. And now we have a waste problem, you know, which is not scientific news. You know, you could have known that from the beginning. But if you then go to India or any other countries, you know, they just see the renderings and they think they have to build this way as well. And then, you know, they are sure they have to pay more money for it. And I think in certain regions, it is really something more a luxurious thing. And then they start setting that trend. And then you see this kind of mismanagement and this misdevelopment of big cities, where basically all the downtowns in the world now look the same. I always call it like the McDonald's effect. If you don't, in a nighttime picture, if you cannot see anymore, if it's Hong Kong, Berlin, New York, or Sao Paulo, I think something is really, really wrong. And I think this culture shift is something we need to have in all the different stakeholders, the investment side, which has their boundaries and their needs, the architects, the clients, the municipalities, but as well, we have to reach people. We have to move out of our expert bubble and really create, I think as well in schools, awareness for the relevance of our built environment, because otherwise, this is kind of a circle we don't get out of. So
what's interesting,
it's teamwork.
Yeah. What you're talking about, Christine, when people talk about smart cities and technology in cities and sort of green utopias, sometimes it does sound like the future is more homogeneous than the past, right?
It's always easier, you know, it's always like this, but, you know, face it, in Europe, 80% of the buildings we see today will be still there in 2050.
Yes.
So in Europe, existing building is the job. And we don't have the luxury anymore. We're not looking at a science fiction movie. We're already in the presence. If you look at the building volume in India, in Africa, South America partly, I mean, we're already in the middle of it. So I think we don't need a new vision and more extravagant things. And I'm actually very critical to all this smartness, because I think in the climate issue, a dumb building is better than a smart building. You just need a simple building, you need a resilient building, you need a building which is built with quality and not fully loaded with technology, which by the time you implement it in a building is already outdated because the planning takes 2 to 3 years for a big building. So, you know, and I think we really have to make that change. And I think we can only make the change in the necessary speed we need now if we really make it into a cultural discussion and change the attitude. And I think many things about sustainable buildings and social issues is it's about doing the right thing. And I think if you look at a lot of things, you wonder, they should have known back then already that this is not the right material, this is not the right architecture, this is not architecture where young families like to live until they're old. You know, if you look at these big residential developments, they were modern after the war. So I think it's about more common sense and that change in culture and more sensitivity to these questions.
Yeah, it strikes me that across all the different business and human rights issues we work on, the built environment is one where you're locking in relationships, power relationships, you know, across generations. There's an intergenerational element to this conversation that has to be, even for generations yet to be born, right? As you mentioned. Nikolai, you've got a request in to tell when this great report's coming out, you've mentioned, and also anything else on policy drivers? A question here about what is it that would really shift investors to get action on climate and human rights? And thanks for mentioning Mary Robinson earlier, who established our organization 11 years ago, and we should be very pleased that you get to mention that. Anyway, Nikolai, over to you.
Yes, I tried to respond to the question, John, in the chat actually with the report, but it's late summer. We don't have a title yet. The main author is Elena Espinosa. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. In terms of policy drivers, I mean, I think we spoke about it quite a bit actually, and I think one of the strong ones in Europe right now is the taxonomy that I mentioned, and as I said, there is this component within that of minimum social safeguards. So that is a driver, certainly, both for the green agenda and human rights. The green agenda is much strong in formulation in there. The minimum safeguards, the provision there, there's not a lot of detail there. So I think that's also poorly understood by the investment community. But nonetheless, a good sign. And then, of course, we have all these different mandatory human rights legislations around Europe, some on narrow issues like modern slavery or child labor, some more wide, and there's more coming down the pipeline. And in a lot of instances, these include the financial sector as well. There might be a size threshold, but so it means that it covers both businesses from an operational point of view, but it would indirectly also include investment activities. So that's another positive driver. And the proposal from the EU right now covers both human rights and climate change explicitly. So we'll see how that lands and what the potential sort of enforcement will be, accountability will be. And then I mentioned it briefly earlier, but there is work underway on a social taxonomy. And without preempting those live discussions, it's quite obvious that there will be an element around housing, which is a key priority within the EU, and there will be probably an attempt to try and say, all right, what are the important criteria here, metrics, to the other question that was raised to me before. This is important so we can be more transparent and clear on the characteristics of different investments and different real estate projects. So keep an eye out for that and that as well. There is a report out for consultation also later in the summer. So just anyone that's interested in that, the social taxonomy will be a quite interesting piece of work under the European Commission. So have a look for that.
Is there a risk, Nikolai, if there is a social taxonomy that will sit apart from the climate, the environmental one, and we are actually reinforcing the division between the E and the S?
Yeah. So there's a design question there. I think it can be mitigated for if, and let me just mention an example. So if you have a particular asset and you would ask the company to report on that from the green taxonomy point of view, and they would report on the social taxonomy as well, you would have both pieces of information together for investors to make judgment on the various characteristics. And just like you have a logic within the environmental taxonomy now that says there's this idea of substantial contribution, so you can make a substantial contribution to climate mitigation, but you shouldn't undermine circular economy at the same time in the do no significant harm. So I think the pieces could be linked. This is not something that has been there's not been made any judgment on yet. That's probably still some time away, but even if they're designed separately, I think it could be solved through those types of decisions.
Very good. Right. Okay, so I'm going to go to each of you now for your sort of summation remarks, concluding remarks, and also anything you can say to challenge us, the audience, the movement, about the way forward. I'm going to go in reverse order. So Suzanne, well, not completely reverse order. I'm going to go Suzanne, Christine, Nikolai, and then Leilani, and I'll come to you at the end. Sorry, Suzanne, there's just been two other questions that have come in. There's been quite a few questions, but two more I want to read out for all of you to have a go at if you want to in your final remarks. There's one that thanks you, Suzanne. This is from Sarah Ahari, who thanks you for bringing in the issue of gender mainstreaming. She's wondering if you've been addressing accessibility, and particularly people with mobility and visual impairment, and acceptability. Related to cultural heritage and in relation to new technology. So maybe you want to comment on that. And there's also a question to all of you, I think, from Chiara Raymer about how should governments and which governments address second homes and holiday homes, which remain empty in foreign countries for most of the year. That's a big issue in many places, I know, right? So Suzanne, final words to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So we brought in, as I already said, in the 19th, gender mainstreaming as one of the pillars of our assessment for social and affordable housing. Accessibility has become more and more important because we are talking about global trends, and we are in the wonderful and very first time that people really can become very old, most of us most likely healthy, but whatever might happen, you could be on this other side, might use a wheelchair or something else might happen. So in Vienna, it is the way, if you build social and affordable housing, it has to be 100% accessible. So you might say, oh, isn't that too expensive? In a certain way, yes, it is expensive. However, if you are aware what you have to pay when you do it afterwards, maybe the normal life cycle, let's like take a family, they are moving in, children growing up, and so on and so forth, and suddenly you are 60, 70, or probably 80 or older, and then you have to do up your home. It's much more expensive. So you have to be aware at which level will you choose. Not everything will be included, but make it the way that you can change it later on easily if it's necessary, or just do it right from the beginning. So yes, accessibility is very high on our agenda, and we do our best to include people whatever age, sex, what nationality, just to have a good social mix in the city, because social mix means social peace. And this is so important if you want to have a high standard of living.
Very good. Thank you very much, Suzanne, for that and all of your comments over the past hour. Christine, final words from you.
Well, I think in the end, it is we have to bring the quality back into the building discussion, and we have to have a holistic approach. It's not either or. It's not the social aspect without the climate issue, without the circular issue. So we really have to bring this holistic approach back to our built environment. I think we have to create more appreciation again for our built environment. And for me, the key thing is really we have to get started. We have to, I think there are many tools out there. There's this great report now out there. So I think there's a lot that can help people to be motivated to get moving. And I think we not always should start with the most difficult part, which is then maybe the informal settlement somewhere. But I think we're in Northern Europe, we have a big responsibility, and maybe even in the US, because we are setting the example. And I've done, 2 years ago, we've done a workshop in India with 30 architects about the climate and cultural sensitive design. And we were talking about low tech and not, you know, the air conditioning is not the way forward and so forth. And we had like this big discussion, you know, now you're coming from Europe and telling us we cannot have your standard. And after a while, one architect said, well, all the things you're saying, is that happening already in Germany or Northern Europe? And I'm like, unfortunately not. And then he said, well, you guys have the money, you have the experience, you know what doesn't work. And if you don't do it, that means you don't really know what to do either. And I was like, my God, what a crazy signal is that we're sending to the world, because people would not believe that we have these political discussions and this in Germany, you know, always like having concerns about certain things. And this is why we're not getting moving. They think we're not doing it because we don't really know the way either. And so this is what I really would like to see, is we have to start doing the right thing. We have to be more ambitious on every project. It doesn't have to be always the perfect solution, but we have to get started. And we have to understand that this is a place where we live, where we work, where we can provide, you know, shelter as well, where we can provide inspiration. So I think it's really about this positive impact of buildings we have to bring back in our discussions. And sometimes it's even the easy measures, and the easy measures are the one which impact the social acceptance, you know, and this is especially to investors, you know, it's not so much more money, just do it, you know, put greenery, put accessibility, you know, really create a space where people like to spend their free time in the summer in the city. And then, you know, we have success, and then we can turn other things around quicker. So let's get started. This is really my main message to everyone.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you for that. Nikolai, final words from you.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, for investors listening in, I would just encourage them to look at the PRI's materials on human rights and just transition, two issues which we're working strongly on. And for everyone else, I just want to recognize, you know, the multi-stakeholder approach that the European Commission has taken, for example, on the taxonomies. And I sit in the social taxonomy group myself as an observer, and it's quite a pleasure to be in a group where, you know, unions are represented, consumer protection agencies are represented, and I think we certainly need this. So I mentioned from the beginning, when it comes to human rights, it is a very new issue for a lot of investors, and I think we do require the input from people on the ground to get the input needed into the investment process. So yeah, just very much welcome that, the multi-stakeholder approach, which is also exactly what's set out in the UN Guiding Principles, of course, ensuring that risks are managed to people, and that people are consulted along the way.
Thank you very much. Leilana.
I'll be brief. Just to say that I don't think that any drive towards zero will be effective in the built environment with respect to housing until and unless the big financial actors are regulated. And I actually have to, I'm going to be provocative here. I think ESG is kind of bogus in this area. I believe firmly and strongly in human rights standards and commitments. These are legal obligations. They're not about the whim of a company or an investor. They are legal obligations that governments around the world have committed to. And those should be the standards that are used as we move forward. I think we have to be honest and have our eyes wide open. These financial actors have huge power and resources. They have, the global value of residential real estate is $220 trillion. That's almost 3 times the entire world's GDP. They have a seat at every political table. BlackRock has been negotiating and dealing with Europe for several years now on this stuff. BlackRock, it's an equity firm. So I think we have to be realistic, and I think multi-stakeholder coming together to say, we want this sector held accountable as we move forward to zero emissions.
Thank you, Leilani, and thank you for the challenge as well at the end. Thank you all. I think it was a really good discussion. I hope it sort of inspires the people listening to this to read the report, to get engaged. There are many things we didn't talk about in the past hour. We didn't really touch supply chain and procurement. We had an event a few weeks ago on copper, and the global demand for copper is going to go up 300%, largely because of built environment requirements. And where's that copper coming from, and the human rights impact of that. So there are many, many dimensions to the discussion. And I'm also sorry that you saw my legs maybe at the beginning. It's hot in summer. I got my shorts on, and my little dog, she was really wanting to get in the room to sit and listen to the conversation. So that's why you saw me scurry to the door briefly at the beginning of the recording, which is now there for posterity. So anyway, thank you all for your time today. Annabelle, back to you.
Very briefly, and a huge thank you both for John facilitating and to the panelists from my side as well. I just wanted to briefly share with everybody that this is obviously a very, very deep and challenging agenda with a huge amount of further conversation and rolling up arms and work to do. So in terms of next steps, don't let this jump off the call and don't take any further action. Download the Better Buildings report from the IHRB website, access the framework that I mentioned earlier, and then find out about the Coalition for Dignity in the Built Environment. So we're working together with Raoul Wallenberg Institute, RAFTO Foundation, and the Australian Human Rights Institute globally to put human rights into built environment policy and practice. So definitely get in touch. And I've shared at the bottom there my own email address, but also Andrea Fidalgo, who recently joined us as the program manager for the built environment based out of Copenhagen. So once again, thank you everybody for a very fruitful conversation, albeit online. I almost felt like we were in the room together.
Thank you.